This happened about 6 years ago when I was working the graveyard shift at a 24-hour gas station just outside of town. I was 19 at the time, desperate for any job that would help me pay for community college. The pay was garbage, but it was steady work, and honestly, how hard could it be to just sit behind a counter all night? Man, was I wrong about that. The gas station was one of those old-school places that hadn't been updated since the 80s. You know the type: flickering fluorescent lights, yellowed ceiling tiles, and that gross industrial carpet that probably hadn't been cleaned in decades. It sat right off Highway 49, about 15 minutes from the nearest town, surrounded by nothing but farmland and those creepy-looking pine forests that seemed to go on forever. During my first couple weeks on the job, the nights were pretty uneventful. I'd get the occasional trucker stopping for coffee and energy drinks, maybe a drunk college kid buying cigarettes, but for the most part, it was just me, my textbooks, and whatever crappy late-night TV I could pick up on the tiny black and white set behind the counter. The weird stuff started happening around my third week. It began with little things that I honestly didn't think much about at first. Items on the shelves would be moved around when I came back from taking bathroom breaks. Nothing major, just like a bag of chips that had been on the top shelf was suddenly on the bottom, or a candy bar facing the wrong direction. I figured it was just customers messing around when I wasn't paying attention. People do weird stuff when they think nobody's watching. But then I started noticing it happening even when nobody had come into the store. I'd be sitting there reading or whatever, glance up at the chip aisle, and swear something had moved. At first, I thought maybe I was just tired. Working overnight shifts really messes with your head, especially when you're trying to go to school during the day too. The real turning point came on a Tuesday night in October. It was one of those nights where the fog was so thick you could barely see 10 feet in front of you. I remember because I kept having to go outside and wipe down the gas pump screens since customers couldn't read them through all the moisture. Around 2 in the morning, this guy pulled up in an old beat-up sedan. He came inside and bought a pack of Marlboros and a large coffee. Nothing unusual about that, except for the way he kept staring at me. Not just looking, but really staring. Like he was studying me or something. He was probably in his 40s, average height, wearing this faded denim jacket that looked like it hadn't been washed in months. His hair was greasy and kind of long, and he had these intense blue eyes that just made me uncomfortable. "You work here alone every night?" he asked while I was ringing him up. "Not every night," I lied. Truth was, I worked alone Sunday through Thursday nights, 5 nights a week. He nodded slowly, still staring at me with those creepy eyes. "Must get lonely out here." "Not really," I said, trying to sound casual. "Stays pretty busy." That was complete BS. After midnight, I was lucky if I saw 5 customers before my shift ended at 6 a.m. He paid for his stuff and left without saying anything else, but I watched him through the window as he got back in his car. Instead of driving away, he just sat there for maybe 10 minutes, engine running, headlights pointed right at the store. I couldn't see him clearly through the fog and the glare of his headlights, but I had this sinking feeling that he was still watching me. Eventually, he drove off, and I tried to shake off the weird encounter. Working nights, you meet all kinds of strange people. I figured he was just some lonely weirdo who didn't know how to make normal conversation. But he came back the next night. Same time, same order, Marlboros and coffee. This time he asked me what time my shift ended. I told him I wasn't sure, which was obviously another lie. He lingered around the store longer that second night, pretending to browse the magazines near the front counter. I could feel him watching me the whole time, and it was making my skin crawl. After he finally left, I called my manager and asked if there was any way to get someone else to work with me on the overnight shifts. I didn't go into detail about why, just said I'd feel more comfortable with backup. My manager basically laughed at me. "Kid, this ain't downtown Detroit. Nothing ever happens out there. Besides, we can barely afford to pay one person overnight, let alone 2. So I was stuck. The creepy guy, I started thinking of him as Denim Jacket, came back a third night. This time, he didn't buy anything. He just walked around the store, picked up random items, put them back down, and kept glancing over at me. I was getting seriously freaked out by this point, so I decided to be more direct. "Can I help you find something specific?" I asked. He looked right at me and smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile, it was the kind of smile that makes you want to take a step back. "Just looking around," he said. "Nice quiet place you got here. Real peaceful." There was something about the way he said peaceful that made my blood run cold. He left without buying anything, but again, he sat in his car in the parking lot for a while before driving off. I was seriously considering quitting at that point. The job wasn't worth dealing with some psycho who was clearly obsessing over me or the store or whatever his deal was. But then he didn't show up the fourth night. Or the fifth. I started thinking maybe he'd moved on or found some other late-night hangout to creep on. I was wrong. The following Tuesday, exactly a week after his first visit, I was restocking the coffee station around 2:30 a.m. when I heard the front door chime. I turned around expecting to see a customer, but nobody was there. The door was closed, and the parking lot was empty. Those old door chimes were pretty sensitive, so I figured it was just the wind or something. But when I walked over to check, the door was locked. I had definitely unlocked it earlier in my shift, and I always kept it unlocked until closing time. That's when I noticed the smell. It was this gross, stale cigarette odor mixed with something else I couldn't quite place. Something musty and unpleasant, like old sweat or dirty clothes. I looked around the store, but everything seemed normal. All the aisles were empty, and nothing appeared to be disturbed. But that smell lingered for the rest of the night. The next night, things got worse. I was sitting behind the counter around 3 a.m. when I heard footsteps coming from the back of the store. Slow, deliberate footsteps, like someone was trying not to be heard. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept under the register. My manager had told me it was there in case of robberies, and called out, "Hey, store's closed for cleaning." It wasn't, but I figured that might scare off whoever was back there. The footsteps stopped. I waited for maybe 30 seconds, then slowly made my way toward the back of the store. The footsteps had seemed to come from the area near the walk-in cooler where we kept the beer and sodas. When I got back there, nobody was around. But the door to the cooler was slightly open. I always kept that door closed tight. It was one of the things on my nightly checklist. And I had definitely closed it earlier. I pushed the door open wider and peered inside. The cooler was small, maybe 6 feet by 8 feet, with metal shelving along the walls stocked with drinks. It was empty, but I could swear I heard something. Like breathing, but really faint. I stood there for probably 5 minutes, just listening. The cooler's compressor was running, so there was background noise, but underneath that, I could have sworn I heard someone trying to breathe quietly. Finally, I convinced myself I was just being paranoid and went back to the front counter. But I kept the baseball bat within reach for the rest of the night. Things escalated over the next few nights. Items would be moved around more frequently, and always when I wasn't looking directly at them. I'd turn my back for 30 seconds to refill the coffee pot, and when I turned around, an entire display of candy bars would be rearranged. I started making mental notes of where everything was, just to make sure I wasn't going crazy. The smell showed up more often too. That same nasty combination of cigarettes and body odor. It would hit me at random times, like when I was mopping the floor or restocking shelves. And I kept hearing those footsteps. Always coming from different parts of the store, always when I was alone and not expecting them. I'd investigate every single time, but I never found anyone. The breaking point came on a Thursday night in early November. I was having a particularly quiet shift, hadn't seen a single customer since around midnight, when I decided to do some deep cleaning in the back room where we kept extra inventory and supplies. It was a small, windowless room behind the main store area, packed with boxes of chips, cases of soda, cigarette cartons, and all the other stuff we sold out front. I was reorganizing some boxes when I heard the front door chime. "Be right with you," I called out, figuring it was just another late-night customer. But when I came out of the back room, the store was empty. And the front door was locked again. That's when I noticed something that made my heart stop. There were wet footprints on the floor, leading from the front door, down the main aisle, and disappearing right around the corner toward the back of the store. Toward the back room where I had just been. The footprints were small, like from bare feet, and they left this grimy residue on the linoleum that looked almost yellowish under the fluorescent lights. I followed the trail, even though every instinct I had was screaming at me to get the hell out of there. The footprints led all the way to the back room and then just stopped. right in front of the doorway. Like whoever it was had been standing there, watching me work. I ran back to the front counter and called the police. 2 officers showed up about 20 minutes later. They were decent guys. I could tell they didn't really think I was making it up, even though they probably got calls from paranoid overnight workers all the time. They walked through the entire store, checked the back room, even looked in the cooler and the tiny employee bathroom. Nothing. But they saw the footprints too. One of the officers took some photos with his phone and asked me if I had any idea who might be messing with me. I told them about Denim Jacket, described him as best I could. They said they'd keep an eye out for his car and maybe do some extra patrols past the station. After they left, I seriously considered just walking out and never coming back. But I needed the job, and I figured now that the police knew about the situation, maybe whoever was doing this would back off. I was wrong about that too. The very next night, around 2 a.m., I was restocking the drink coolers when I heard a voice. Working hard, I see. I spun around, and there he was. Denim Jacket. Standing right behind me, maybe 3 feet away. I hadn't heard him come in. I hadn't heard the door chime. Nothing. How did you get in here? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He smiled that same creepy smile from before. Door was open. It wasn't. I had been checking the door obsessively all week, making sure it stayed locked when I was in the back areas of the store. I'm going to have to ask you to leave, I said, reaching for the phone behind the counter. Oh, I'm not here to cause trouble, he said, but he didn't move. Just wanted to see how you were doing. You seemed pretty shaken up last night when those cops were here. My blood went cold. There was no way he could have known about the police visit unless he had been watching the store. I said you need to leave. Now. He took a step closer. You know, I've been thinking about you. About this place. Real quiet out here. Real isolated. I grabbed the baseball bat from under the counter and held it up. Get out. Now. Or I'm calling the cops. For a split second, his friendly mask slipped, and I saw something really dark in his eyes. Something that made me realize I was in way more danger than I had thought. But then he smiled again and raised his hands like he was surrendering. Hey, no need for that. I was just being friendly. He backed toward the door, still smiling. I'll see you around. After he left, I immediately called the police again. This time, they took it more seriously. They came out, took a full statement, and one of the officers stayed with me for the rest of my shift. They also ran the license plate number I had managed to get when Denim Jacket left that night. Turns out the guy had a record. Nothing violent, but a string of harassment complaints and restraining orders from various women over the past few years. His name was Carl something, I can't remember his last name. The police had a talk with him, and he apparently agreed to stay away from the gas station. That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. Because I realized that Carl hadn't been the one leaving those footprints. His feet were way too big, and he always wore boots. The prints I had seen were small and bare. Someone else had been in that store. Someone I had never seen. And they were still coming around. The footprints showed up twice more over the next week, always when I was working alone, always leading to wherever I happened to be in the store. I finally quit after that. Told my manager I was moving back home to live with my parents, which was actually true. I was way too freaked out to keep living by myself. But before I left town, I did some research on the gas station. Turns out it had a pretty dark history that nobody had bothered to mention when I got hired. Back in 1987, a guy named Jimmy Reeves had worked the overnight shift there. One night in December, he just disappeared. His car was still in the parking lot, his jacket was still hanging behind the counter, but Jimmy was gone. They never found him. The official theory was that he had probably been robbed and killed, and his body was dumped somewhere out in those woods. But they never found any evidence of a struggle, and the register hadn't been touched. It was like he had just vanished. After reading about that, I started wondering if maybe Jimmy hadn't left the gas station after all. Maybe he was still there. Still working the night shift. I never went back to confirm my theory, and I sure as hell never took another overnight job. But sometimes, when I'm having trouble sleeping, I think about that place. I think about those small, bare footprints. And I wonder if Jimmy is still there, walking around that old gas station, trying to figure out what happened to him. Or maybe waiting for someone to finally notice him. Either way, I'm glad it's not my problem anymore.